Good evening, I'm Laurie Johnson. Welcome to Houston Public Media's web series, Political Perspectives. Every week I'll be joined by show commentators Jay Aiyer and Brandon Rottinghaus to discuss all things political. Tonight we'll continue the conversation from red, white, and blue about the state of education. So let's get started, Jay and Brandon. One thing that I would like to just have as an overview is let's talk a little bit about the funding system for education in Texas, the so-called Robin Hood plan, which is where we take money from the rich districts and give it to the poor districts. This is a very complicated system. There's lawsuits over it. It's one of the reasons that HISD has a budget shortfall this year. Explain this to us a little bit.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing we could spend the entire show on, probably our entire season on. But in a nutshell, Texas has a constitutional responsibility to provide for adequate public schools. This actually went into the Constitution in 1869, the Reconstruction Constitution, in part because the design was that they wanted to have local control as opposed to having the federal government come say something. So the debate at the time was whether or not they should do it, period. And so the fact that this is something that Texas does is actually something that violates its own kind of frontier spirit of we're going to do it ourselves. In this case, let the state do it. The funding is a mix of a bunch of different pots, and this is why it gets complicated, not only from a mathematical point of view, but also from just a year-to-year point of view, where you've got these pools of money that are increasing and decreasing. A quarter comes from the fuel tax, a quarter comes from the severance taxes, some of the money from the state lottery goes into it, and so there's lots of different little pools of money that are being funneled into it, and that creates this constant flux of money and often creates a shortfall, and especially in economic hard times, and that's why there have been lawsuits with respect to the school finance system. And
so one of the lawsuits is in the U.S. Supreme Court right now.
Well, yeah, in the Texas Supreme Court. And
I'm sorry, thank you.
Yeah, and in the Texas Supreme Court, and it's part and parcel because of two separate issues. So the state constitution, as Brandon said, talks about two provisions. You have to have an adequate and an equitable system. So you have to adequately fund our education system, and you have to equitably do it. We also have a bar on a statewide property tax. And so the way we fund education largely is we take local tax dollars, we pool it at the state, and then we divide it up because we have to create this arduous process because we can't have a state system. We have to create a series of local systems. And so the court is trying to decide, because of a series of budget cuts in the past, of whether or not the state is contributing enough and it's meeting its responsibility to provide an adequate education. At the same time, whether or not that the way we have it, the way we have it structured right now is not equitable, meaning that some school districts are spending more versus others, and that's what's creating a lot of this confusion. So it's at the Supreme Court. They have basically consistently ruled, because this comes up every so often, that it's not adequate. So it'll be fascinating to see what the Supreme Court does, and it has a $1 billion impact on the state of Texas's budget.
And so this is also putting HISD in an interesting situation where they are considered a property-rich district, right, meaning lots of property taxes coming in from high land values, versus their economically disadvantaged student population. So even though they have low income and poverty students, they're having to give money away instead of being able to reinvest it back into the district.
Right, exactly. So 75% of the kids who attend HISD would consider lower socioeconomic status or poor children. But we're a property-rich district because the HISD boundaries contain a lot of high-value commercial and residential property. So it's based on the taxable rate, not necessarily sort of the students that you're serving. And when you compare that to other places, we're considered property rich. So that means this year, about $106 million has to go back to the state of Texas to be divided up, and if they by other school districts. And if they don't do that, then they'll start attaching different parts of Houston ISD's property base, tax base, and assigning it to other districts. So it's a huge impact. And could have some serious effects on how much money gets spent in the classroom here in Houston.
So going into even broader, we hear a lot about the Texas education crisis and where Texas scores on various, rankings, whether it be graduation rates or, student testing or teacher retention. Is Texas really the problem, or are we looking at a systemic national education issue?
I think that there's something larger at work for sure. In fact, some of these rankings don't necessarily have a curve. You've got lots of grouped states at C and D and some at F. And so the organizations that are doing the rankings do acknowledge that there is an ongoing crisis. And I think that Texas is certainly part of that. A lot of these are related to the fact that the pay for teachers is so low. Part of it is that the retention is so bad, especially in some areas of the state. And so the state in and of itself, I think, is creating this perpetual problem where they're not able to fix it. And the question is where the political will come from to fix it. As Jay said, this lawsuit is going to potentially cost the state a couple of, 20 to possibly $25 billion in the biennium, and that's going to create a huge structural problem for the state that's going to have to pony up this money somewhere. Every time this has happened and you've had this kind of major reform, it has always been the case that governors have gone down in flames, right? Mark White in the 80s tried to change the system and temporarily was able to make a truce with the teachers, but it didn't last long because the certification procedures became very unpopular. And Richards was the one who created the Robin Hood plan, and that also became an issue for her in the race. Now we have a backlash on testing, which was George W. Bush's baby. So the fact that there's this kind of cyclical fad in how the funding situation happens is creating this kind of perpetual political problem for people. So the political will to tackle it, I think, is pretty low. The fact that we've had 7 lawsuits since 1985 and 1984 on school funding in Texas shows you that there is this constant flux, and that's something that creates this political undercurrent that makes it difficult to get anything done.
So Jay, you wrote an op-ed in the Houston Chronicle about some education issues, specifically in the 5th Ward. And I think it's really important to dig into what we're talking about is more than education. We're talking about poverty issues.
Right.
Children in wealthy school districts or in wealthy schools or schools with active parent-teacher organizations tend to do better than students in poor neighborhoods or with schools where the parents aren't as involved, whether it be lack of education or lack of availability and access, perhaps transportation, perhaps work, whatever. This is an underlying issue that a school board can't necessarily fix.
Right. It's an incredibly difficult situation for anyone or any single entity to try to fix. What we do know is this. We know that, and I said this earlier, 75% of HISD are kids that we would consider poor or coming from impoverished backgrounds. 25% are not. And the simple reality is, when you look at it, those 25% that are coming from advantaged backgrounds do well. The 75% are really where the issue is. Some of those kids are doing well because they were coming from families where there are those additional resources provided, maybe not for them, but by other people. We call that social capital, where they may have an active grandparent, or they're attending a charter school, or they may be attending a magnet school, or even a neighborhood school where there's a lot of sort of parental involvement, or they're attending a school with a diverse socioeconomic sort of student body, right? What we found is, if you look at the data, that if you have a classroom that has a lot of mixture, right, the peer effects can be significant. But when you have schools that are essentially all poor, 80%, 90%, it's very, very difficult for those kids to do well because of some of the underlying structural problems. So how do we deal with those issues? And that's the entire crux of the debate. There are some folks who believe that we can do it by doing these sort of in-class reforms, right? We can provide more time and attention on task, and that can solve our problems. And then there's also another approach that says that's not enough. We have to have a broader community-wide effort to try to supplement with what they call, it's called a community school movement, or these wraparound services. The problem with that is it's incredibly expensive. We're talking about nutritional programs, educational programs, supplementing the basic ISD, and all those other services associated, healthcare. And that's really, really expensive, and that's what makes it so hard. And that's exists not just in the Fifth Ward, it exists all over. And that's really the debate. It's not just a debate here, it's a debate in every city and every community in the country, particularly where there's large pockets of poverty. So when you look at states that are doing well and districts that are doing well, there tend to be wealthier areas. So Massachusetts, Maryland, great school systems, wealthy states. Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, poor states, terrible school systems.
And so then you get down to some fundamental questions too of how much should the state or the school district be involved in these sort of ancillary issues that aren't directly about education in the classroom.
I think there's a sense that, in fact, they are related and that keeping them distinct is a serious problem. But in general, the problems are ignored. There have been reports that have come out lately that suggest that the youngest in the state are really the most at risk. You've got 1 out of 4 who are in poverty. You've got high percentages of young people who don't have health insurance. You've got a huge problem with the CPS and with the foster care system, right, which the state's going to have to take a look at. So there's a real risk to being young in Texas. And I think that is a disaster for thinking about where the state's going to be in the next 20, 25 years. So it's education for sure, but there's so much bigger options and so many more problems that are involved in this that have to be thought through. And it's going to require an absolute tub of money to fix, right? We're going into a legislative session where you've got school finance on the agenda. You're going to have potential blowback on huge chunks of finance from the system that has franchise taxes. You've got potentially the problem to fix the foster care system, which could be $100 million per biennium. So you've got big issues, not to mention like guns and all, who knows what's going to come up between now and then. These are all things that are going to have to be packed into a 140-day session. It's going to be hard for any one problem to be fixed. And you throw in the political machinations about charter schools versus, school choice, and then teacher accountability and these kinds of things. It becomes very political very quickly. So the fact that these problems are all kind of stirring at the same moment, I think, is a serious blow for how to solve any particular one of them.
Which maybe explains why we still have all of these issues dating back to the Industrial Revolution. You can't just solve this in a couple years. It takes generations to fix some of these underlying issues. Yeah. So, well, thank you both so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure talking about this. Thank you for watching the program. Remember to log on to houstonpublicmedia.org/perspectives every Friday night at 8 p.m. following the 7:30 broadcast of Red, White, and Blue. Thanks so much for watching. See you again next week.